The streets of Chicago were unkind to the desperate. Amelia had spent 6 long months searching for a job, any job, that could put food on her table and keep a roof over her head. The once thriving city, with its towering skyscrapers and endless streets of opportunity, now felt like an unforgiving maze, each turn leading to another rejection. Bills were piling up, her savings were long gone, and she had exhausted every favor she could ask for. She refused to return home a failure. There was no home left to return to. But today was different. Today, she had finally found something. It wasn't glamorous, nor was it what she had envisioned for herself. A real estate firm had hired her as a cleaner, and although the pay was meager, it was something. It meant she could buy food without counting every dollar in her pocket. It meant she wouldn't have to skip meals just to stretch what little she had left. The work was tough, scrubbing floors, dusting endless rows of shelves, and taking out the trash after everyone else had left. But Amelia didn't mind. At least she had a job again, and that was enough. One chilly morning, as she walked her usual route to work, her breath visible in the cold air, she noticed something that made her slow down. An elderly woman sat hunched over on the sidewalk, her frail shoulders trembling. Her silver hair was unkempt, and her thin coat did little to shield her from the biting wind. Amelia had seen the city's indifference before. People rushing past the homeless, avoiding eye contact, pretending they didn't exist. But something about this woman stopped her in her tracks. Tears streaked the woman's wrinkled face as she clutched an empty purse to her chest. Amelia's heart clenched. "Ma'am, are you okay?" she asked, crouching beside her. The woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice shaking. "Some boys, they took my bag, my money, my phone, everything. I just got to Chicago to see my son, but now I have no way to reach him. I don't even know where to go." Amelia felt a sharp pang of empathy. She knew what it was like to feel lost, abandoned by the world. The woman looked so fragile, so defeated. She had probably spent the night in the cold, with no one to help her. The city was too busy to care, but Amelia wasn't. "Don't worry, ma'am," Amelia said, her voice firm with determination. "We'll find a way." The woman hesitated, scanning Amelia's face, searching for sincerity. When she found it, she gave a small, uncertain nod. Amelia helped her to her feet. "Come with me. I work nearby. We can figure something out there." As they walked toward the real estate office, Amelia had no idea how much this small act of kindness would change her life forever. Amelia's hands clenched into fists as she stormed out of the office, the weight of Madeline's cruel words still ringing in her ears. The injustice burned through her like fire, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. Outside, Mama was still standing in the cold, her frail shoulders shaking from more than just the bitter wind. Amelia exhaled sharply, forcing her anger aside as she approached. "Mama, don't listen to her," she said gently, wrapping an arm around the woman's trembling form. "You are not trash. You are someone's mother. You deserve respect." Mama sniffled, nodding, but Amelia could see the shame in her downcast eyes. The woman had lived long enough to know that the world was cruel to those without power, and today had only been a reminder of that ugly truth. But Amelia refused to let that be the end of it. Taking a deep breath, she hailed a taxi, guiding Mama inside. The ride home was silent, save for the occasional sniffle from the older woman. Amelia fought the lump in her throat, rage and helplessness battling inside her. How could someone be so heartless? She had always known people like Madeline existed, people who thought wealth and status made them superior, but seeing it up close, seeing the pain it had caused, made her stomach twist. By the time they reached her tiny apartment, Amelia had made a decision. She wasn't just going to let this go. Inside, she helped Mama settle onto the small couch, handing her a blanket. "Let's get you something to eat," she murmured, heading toward the kitchen. The scent of warm stew soon filled the air, but Amelia's mind was elsewhere. Her phone vibrated against the counter. She hesitated before answering. "Amelia?" came Richard Lancaster's voice, cold and impersonal. Amelia stiffened. "Sir, I heard what happened," he said, his tone unreadable. "You disrespected my fiancé in front of the entire office." Amelia swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. "With all due respect, sir, your fiancé humiliated an innocent woman and threw her onto the street like garbage." There was silence on the other end. Then, a sigh. "You should have let security handle it. You put yourself in a position you shouldn't have." Amelia's grip on the phone tightened. "So, you're defending her?" "This isn't about sides," Richard said. "It's about workplace conduct, and I can't have someone undermining authority in my office. I'm sorry, Amelia. You're fired." The words echoed through the small apartment. Amelia let out a slow breath, her fingers gripping the counter. She had expected this, but it still hit her like a punch to the gut. "Understood," she said flatly, and hung up. Mama was watching her, concern in her eyes. "My child, what happened?" Amelia forced a smile, though it felt like glass shattering in her chest. "Nothing, Mama, just work stuff." But deep inside she knew this wasn't over. And Richard Lancaster would soon realize that firing her had been his biggest mistake. The next morning, Amelia woke up to the sound of Mama humming softly as she moved about the small apartment. Despite everything that had happened, the older woman carried herself with a quiet resilience, as if years of hardship had taught her that no storm lasted forever. Amelia, however, wasn't feeling as optimistic. The sting of losing her job still clung to her, a cruel reminder of how unfair life could be. She had spent months searching for work, only to have it snatched away in an instant, all because she had dared to stand up to someone who thought power gave them the right to treat others like dirt. But she had no regrets. As she set a cup of tea in front of Mama, the older woman gave her a warm smile. "Thank you, my dear. You are too kind." Amelia shook her head. "It's the least I can do. How are you feeling today?" Mama sighed. "Better, now that I have my phone number back." She patted the small device on the table. I finally called my son. Amelia's breath hitched. You did? What did he say? Tears welled in Mama's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. He was so worried. He thought something terrible had happened to me. Her voice trembled. He's sending a car to pick me up. He wants me to come home. Amelia smiled, though her chest felt unexpectedly tight. She should have been happy, and she was. But the thought of Mama leaving felt like losing something she hadn't even realized she needed. You'll be safe with him, Amelia said softly, squeezing the woman's hand. Mama nodded, but her expression was distant. Yes. But Amelia, there's something I must tell you. Before Amelia could ask what she meant, a sleek black car pulled up outside. Amelia walked Mama to the door, hesitating as she helped her inside the vehicle. Promise me something, Mama said, gripping Amelia's hands tightly. No matter what happens, don't let life make you bitter. Your kindness, it will take you places. Amelia nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. I promise. As the car drove away, she let out a slow breath. It wasn't until later that night, as she sat alone in her tiny apartment, that her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Amelia? A deep voice filled her ear, unfamiliar but warm. This is James Lancaster. My mother told me everything. Amelia's breath caught. Your mother? The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. Yes, he said, and I need to see you, tomorrow. Amelia's heart pounded as the realization crashed into her. Mama's son, the man she had been searching for all along, and he was Richard Lancaster's brother. The next morning, Amelia barely had time to process her emotions before she found herself standing in front of a towering glass skyscraper, the headquarters of Lancaster Industries. The name gleamed in gold letters above the grand entrance, a stark contrast to the modest world she had always known. She swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her purse as she tried to steady her nerves. She had no idea what to expect from this meeting, no idea why James Lancaster, the mysterious son Mama had been searching for, wanted to see her. But she knew one thing. Whatever was about to happen would change her life forever. A uniformed receptionist greeted her at the front desk, barely sparing her a glance before pressing a button on her earpiece. Mr. Lancaster, your guest has arrived. Moments later, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open, and out stepped a man who carried himself with effortless authority. James Lancaster. Tall, well-dressed, with sharp blue eyes that bore into her as he approached. He was nothing like his brother Richard. Where Richard was cold and ruthless, James exuded something else. Something steady, controlled. Amelia, he said, his voice smooth but firm. I'm glad you came. She nodded, her pulse quickening. I almost didn't. His lips quirked slightly, as if he wasn't surprised. Come with me. She followed him into the elevator, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. When the doors closed, James finally spoke again. My mother told me what you did for her, he said, his gaze fixed ahead. She told me how you helped her when no one else would. Amelia shifted uncomfortably. Anyone with a heart would have done the same. James turned to her then, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. You'd be surprised. The elevator doors opened to reveal a luxurious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Amelia barely had time to take in the view before James gestured toward a seat. She sat cautiously, watching as he leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I need you to tell me everything, he said, from the moment you found my mother to the moment she called me. So she did. She told him about the cold morning she found Mama on the street, about the way she had been thrown out of the real estate firm by Madeline, about how Amelia had risked everything just to make sure Mama was safe. By the time she finished, James's expression had darkened. "I can't believe Richard allowed this to happen," he muttered. Amelia frowned. "What do you mean?" James exhaled sharply. "I mean, my brother knew our mother was missing, and he did nothing about it." Her stomach dropped. James's jaw tightened. "And now I have to make sure he pays for it." Amelia sat frozen as the weight of his words settled over her. This wasn't just about kindness anymore. This was about justice. James Lancaster sat at his desk, his fingers steepled together as he processed everything Amelia had just told him. The quiet hum of the city below his office window seemed deafening in the silence that stretched between them. His mother, his own flesh and blood, had been humiliated and abandoned in the cold, all while his brother, Richard, had done nothing to help her. And worse, Madeline Monroe, the woman Richard had been planning to marry, had treated her like garbage. Amelia sat across from him, her expression tense as she watched him carefully. She had done so much for his mother, expecting nothing in return. It was a rare thing, selflessness, in a world like theirs. He exhaled sharply. "I won't let this go unanswered." Amelia arched a brow. "And what exactly do you plan to do?" James pushed back his chair and stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. "Richard needs to be reminded that power is not a shield for cruelty." His gaze darkened. "And Madeline? She'll regret the day she ever disrespected my mother." A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine, but she remained silent, watching as James reached for his phone. "Connor," he said, his voice sharp and authoritative, "I want a full report on everything Richard has been up to in the last 6 months. Business dealings, financial records, personal scandals. I want it all. And get me the security footage from the office lobby the day my mother was thrown out." Amelia's eyes widened. "You're digging into your own brother?" James met her gaze, unflinching. "Richard lost the right to be called my brother when he let our mother suffer." A tense silence followed, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Amelia wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or worried. Then, as if on cue, the doors to James's office burst open. Richard Lancaster stormed in, his face flushed with anger. His designer suit was impeccable, but his composure was anything but. "What the hell, James?" he spat. "I just got word you're digging into my records? What is this about?" James leaned against his desk, completely unfazed. "It's about our mother, Richard. You remember her, don't you?" Richard's jaw clenched. "Of course I do. What does that have to do with anything?" Amelia's stomach twisted as she watched James let out a bitter chuckle. "Funny," James mused. "Because she spent hours sitting outside our house in the cold, waiting for you to acknowledge her. But you were too busy playing house with Madeline to notice." Richard's face paled. "That's not. Don't lie to me." James's voice was sharp as a blade. "I have security footage. I know what happened." Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. Amelia held her breath. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was a reckoning. The tension in the Lancaster mansion was suffocating. The chandeliers gleamed overhead, their golden light doing nothing to warm the icy atmosphere in the grand living room. James Lancaster sat in a high-backed leather chair, his fingers drumming against the mahogany armrest as he watched his brother pace the room. Richard was unraveling before his eyes, his usual arrogance faltering, his composure slipping. "You think you can just destroy me?" Richard's voice was sharp, tinged with desperation. "Over one mistake?" James let out a slow, humorless chuckle. Mistake? His eyes flashed with fury. Leaving our mother to sit outside in the cold for hours was not a mistake, Richard. It was a choice. Amelia sat on the far side of the room, silent but observing. She had never seen this side of James before. The man who had seemed cold and detached now burned with barely contained anger. He wasn't just seeking justice, he was seeking something far deeper. Richard scoffed, running a frustrated hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You're acting like I abandoned her on purpose. I didn't even know she was out there." James stood, his presence commanding. "And why was that?" He took a slow step forward, his voice calm but laced with menace. "Because you were too busy listening to Madeline, weren't you? Too busy playing the role of the perfect fiancé to a woman who saw our mother as trash." Richard's face twisted in guilt, but he wasn't ready to admit defeat. "Madeline was protecting me. She thought—" "She thought?" James cut him off, his tone turning razor sharp. "And what about you, Richard? Did you think at all?" The weight of James's words hung in the air. Amelia could feel the power shift in the room. Richard had always been the golden son, the one who basked in their father's approval, while James had carved his own path. But now, Richard looked small, like a child caught in a lie. James sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, as if tired of his brother's excuses. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice like iron. "You're stepping down from the company." Richard's head snapped up. "What?" "You heard me." James's jaw tightened. "You don't deserve the power you have. I've already spoken to the board. Your shares, consider them bought out." Richard's hands curled into fists. "You can't do this." James smirked. "I already did." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Richard's gaze flickered to Amelia, as if searching for support, but she only looked at him with quiet disappointment. And then, for the first time, Richard Lancaster truly understood. He had lost, not just his company, not just his power. He had lost the one thing money couldn't buy, his family's respect, and there was no getting it back. The Lancaster mansion no longer felt like an untouchable fortress, at least, not to Amelia. The grand halls, once intimidating and sterile, now held an air of change. The very foundation of power within the house had shifted, and she had somehow found herself at the center of it. She stood at the edge of the marble staircase, watching as James paced the living room below. His sharp features were tense, his usual calculated demeanor cracking just slightly. For a man who had spent years controlling everything around him, this moment was different. This wasn't just business, it was personal. "You're awfully quiet," he finally said, his deep voice breaking the silence. He turned toward her, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. Amelia hesitated before stepping down the stairs, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I'm just trying to figure out what happens next," she admitted, folding her arms. James studied her, something unreadable flickering in his expression. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said, his tone softer than she expected. "You've already done enough." Amelia scoffed, shaking her head. "Enough?" Her eyes flashed with defiance. "James, your family's entire empire just shifted overnight. You made an enemy out of your own brother? And you think now is the time for me to walk away?" His lips quirked slightly, the closest thing to amusement she'd seen on his face in days. "You make it sound like I need you here." Amelia tilted her head, her voice steady. "Don't you?" That made him pause. For the first time, James looked uncertain. He exhaled slowly, stepping closer. "I don't know what I need," he admitted. "I just know that for the first time in my life, I don't have all the answers." Amelia swallowed, her pulse quickening. This was uncharted territory. James Lancaster wasn't a man who admitted to weaknesses, but here he was, standing in front of her, letting the weight of everything settle between them. She took a breath. Then maybe we figure it out together. A long silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. And for the first time, neither of them looked away. Change was coming, and neither of them was ready to run from it. The Lancaster mansion, once a monument to power and control, now felt different. Warmer, softer. The sharp edges of its past had begun to dull, though the scars of old wounds still lingered in the air. Amelia could feel them, woven into the very foundation of the house, hidden behind the luxurious walls, whispering in the silence of the night. She stood in the study, her fingers grazing the edge of an old leather-bound book on the grand mahogany desk. It smelled of aged paper and memories, of a history she barely knew but was slowly becoming a part of. Behind her, James leaned against the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "You look lost in thought," he said, his voice low. Amelia exhaled, turning to face him. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she admitted, "and how much hasn't." James smirked faintly, but didn't argue. Instead, he stepped inside, his presence filling the space with something she couldn't quite name. "Change takes time," he said, walking toward the window. The city skyline stretched beyond the glass, glittering in the dark. "But I don't think either of us is the same person we were when this all started." Amelia studied him. The man before her was still powerful, still commanding, but something in his posture was different, less rigid, less guarded. "I never thought I'd be standing here," she admitted. "Not in this house. Not in your life." James turned to her, his gaze steady. "Do you regret it?" The question made her pause. Regret? It would have been easier to say yes, easier to pretend she hadn't been drawn into this world, that she didn't care about the man standing before her, but the truth had long since become impossible to ignore. "No," she said finally, "I don't." A silence stretched between them, thick, unspoken, filled with something neither of them had the courage to put into words. James nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the window pane. "Good." Amelia arched a brow. "That's it? Just good?" He let out a quiet chuckle, running a hand through his hair. "Would you rather I declare some grand realization? Spill my soul in a poetic confession?" She smirked, stepping closer. "I think I'd pay to see that." James rolled his eyes but didn't move away. "Don't hold your breath." But then, so subtly it almost didn't happen, his hand brushed against hers. It was brief, fleeting, but it sent a spark through her veins, a silent promise of something unfinished. Amelia didn't pull away, and neither did he. The past was still there, lingering between them, waiting to be reckoned with. But for the first time, it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like the beginning of something new. The morning sun bathed the Lancaster mansion in a golden hue, streaming through the grand windows and spilling across the marble floors. For the first time, the house no longer felt like an untouchable monument of wealth. It felt like a home. Amelia stood in the doorway of the sunlit kitchen, watching as James helped his mother prepare breakfast. It was an image she never would have imagined when she first met him. A man so used to commanding boardrooms now patiently following his mother's instructions on how to flip pancakes properly. She couldn't help but smile. "Are you just going to stand there and admire, or are you going to help?" James teased, glancing at her over his shoulder. Amelia chuckled, stepping forward. "I'd rather not be responsible for burning down your kitchen." James smirked as he handed her a plate. Then you can be in charge of serving." As she moved around the kitchen, setting plates on the long wooden dining table, a warm sense of familiarity settled over her. It was strange how natural this felt, how easily she had slipped into this world, a world she once thought she'd never belong in. As they sat down to eat, James's mother, Margaret, looked at Amelia with a knowing smile. "You know, my dear, I've watched my son chase success for years, but I don't think I've ever seen him quite like this." James rolled his eyes. "Mother, please." Amelia glanced at him, her heart skipping a beat at the faint blush dusting his cheeks. Margaret simply laughed. "I'm just saying, change is a good thing." Amelia met James's gaze, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something unspoken in his eyes. Something real. The past had brought them together in the most unexpected way, but it was the present, the small, quiet moments like this that had built something worth holding on to. Later that evening, as Amelia stood on the grand balcony overlooking the city, James joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered her one, and she accepted, the cool glass grounding her in the moment. "So," he said, leaning against the railing, "what now?" Amelia exhaled slowly. "I don't know." She turned to him. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid to find out." James studied her for a long moment before reaching for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it said everything neither of them had the courage to put into words. "We'll figure it out together," he murmured. Amelia squeezed his hand, a smile tugging at her lips. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was starting over. And this time, she wasn't alone.